Every one of us knew him, or we knew the man our fathers called. When the set in the front room went bad, you did not throw it out and drive to the store for another. You picked up the telephone, and a little while later, a man came to the door with a wood case in his hand and knew exactly what to do. He kept a shop on Main Street, or he worked out of his own garage, and the whole town trusted him with the one machine the family gathered around every night. For about 40 years, there was one in every town. Then, across a single decade, he was gone. This is the story of the television repairman and of how a trade the whole country leaned on came quietly to its end. The night. The picture rolled. The television was the biggest thing in the room and the most expensive thing in the house after the car. It sat in a wood cabinet with legs, heavy enough that 2 grown men were needed to move it, and it held the place a fireplace once held. Families bought these sets the way they bought a refrigerator, paying a little each month to the finance company, and they expected them to last. A good console was real money in a working man's week. So when the screen went, it mattered. The picture would start to roll, the same frame tumbling over and over however you worked the knob. Sometimes it shrank to a single bright dot in the middle of the glass and sat there humming. Or a ball game came through loud and clear, with nothing but black where the picture should have been. Nobody in the house touched the back of the set. There was high voltage in there, everyone knew that much, and there was a folded diagram pasted inside the cabinet meant for somebody else's eyes. What you did was call. Every family had a number for it, written inside a kitchen cabinet door or kept in a wife's address book, and the voice on the other end said he would come by later in the week, and he did. He came up the walk in work clothes with a wood case in one hand, set it down just inside the door, and asked which set was giving trouble. He was no stranger to you. You had seen him at church, or his boy was in your boys' class, and he had been to the house before. That case by the door held everything. The visit turned on, though no one looked twice at it yet. For now, it was only a box a working man carried to a job. There were 2 ways a town knew this man. Some of us drove our trouble to him, down to a storefront on Main Street with sets glowing in the window. The rest of us waited at home for the knock. Either way, he was about to do something to that television that almost no repairman would be able to do to the sets that came later. Main Street and the house call. He had learned the work in the service, most likely, or from another man who had learned it the same way. Radio came first for a lot of them. A man who could fix a radio in 1940 could fix a television in 1953, because the insides were much the same glass tubes and the same patient reading of where the signal stopped. By the time every house had a set, every town had at least one of these men, and the bigger towns had a dozen. The storefront kind kept a shop on the main drag with the name painted on the glass, radio and television service, and a few repaired sets lined up in the window with their cabinets gleaming. Inside, the front counter held a cash register and a rack of the most common tubes, and behind a curtain was the bench where the real work happened. Sets waited their turn on the floor, each one tagged with the customer's name on a paper ticket. The smell back there stayed with you. The hot dust and solder smell that a working tube set gave off. On a winter evening, those repaired sets in the window stopped people on the sidewalk, a row of moving pictures glowing out into the dark in a time when a lot of homes still had only the one. The other kind worked from home and came to you. His shop was a corner of the garage or a back room, and his advertising was his own good name carried across a fence. This was the man most of us remember when we remember him at all. The one our mothers gave coffee while a curious boy stood at his elbow and watched. And there, again, was the case he carried. Up close, it was a thing of real beauty. A wood or stout cardboard box with a hinged lid and rows of square compartments, each one holding a tube in its own printed carton. The names on those cartons were the names on the sets themselves: RCA and Sylvania, Raytheon and Zenith. Some of the cases had a tube tester built right into the lid, a meter and a few sockets, so the man could test as he worked. A boy could lose an afternoon just looking at it, all those little glass bottles standing in their slots. What set this man apart was that he knew things. He could stand in front of a misbehaving television and tell, from the symptoms where the trouble lived, by sound and picture and long experience. A rolling picture meant one thing, a dark screen another, a high whine something else again. He carried the workings of 100 different chassis in his head, and where his memory ran out, he had the paper to fall back on. In a decade when a man's worth was often measured by what he could fix, the repairman sat near the top of the list, below the doctor maybe, but above most everyone else who came to your door. That standing was real. Our fathers respected him because he could do what they could not, and our fathers were men who could do a great deal. What he actually did, once the back of the set came off, was the heart of the trade behind the cabinet back. The work started with a screwdriver and a careful hand. He laid the set on its face or turned it to reach the rear panel, took out the screws, and lifted the fiberboard back away from the chassis. Warm air came off it, carrying that smell again. Inside stood a couple dozen tubes in their sockets, glowing soft orange where the heaters still ran, wired together over a metal chassis crowded with resistors and capacitors. Most of the time, the trouble was simple, and he half knew it before he arrived. A frayed line cord, a tuner gone dirty and scratchy that wanted cleaning, a single tube that had given out after its years of service, because the tubes were the parts most likely to fail, glass bottles with a filament inside that eventually burned through. The fix for that was the case by the door. He would find the dead tube, sometimes by eye, the glass gone dark or silvered where it should have been clear, and pull a fresh one from its slot. Often, that was the whole repair, 10 minutes and a tube, and the picture steadied and came back while the family pretended not to hover. When it was not simple, he reached for the diagram. The makers folded a wiring map into the cabinet of the set, pasted to the inside of the back panel or tucked into a little envelope, every part and every connection laid out for exactly this moment. For the sets where the diagram was missing or worn away, the shops kept thick books of them. A company called Ryder gathered the diagrams for nearly every set made and published them by the volume. Year after year, a whole library of how things worked. With the map in hand, he hunted. He had a meter to read voltages and a good ear for the hum and snap of a live circuit, and he traced the signal along until he found the place it stopped. Out came the soldering iron, the smell of hot rosin joining the rest, and he lifted a swollen capacitor that had leaked or freed a solder joint that had cracked with the years of heating and cooling and set things right. A color set asked even more of him. There was convergence to set, so the three colors stacked up into one clean picture, and purity to adjust, so the reds held true into the corners of the screen. A careful man took his time over both. When the work was finished, he stood the set upright, switched it on, and waited out the long half-minute while the tubes came up to heat, and the picture opened out from a bright line in the middle of the glass. The whole family watched that part. A man down on his knees on the living room rug, sleeves pushed back, was a small event in a quiet week, and the children were told to leave him be, and mostly did. Some jobs were too deep for the living room. When a set needed real time on the bench, he tagged it and carried it off, and that was the sentence every household dreaded. Your television gone to the shop for the better part of a week. A house with one set and no picture in it was a long week in those years. The lucky families had a small second set in a back bedroom. The rest read more or sat with the radio until the call came that it was ready. And for all his skill, a good part of the time you did not need to call him at all. The simplest repair there was, swapping a tube, was something a careful man could do himself, and the town gave him a place to do it that sat right between the bread and the aspirin. The tester at the drugstore. It came down to a brown paper bag and a short walk. When a set went dark, before you ever spent money on a service call, you pulled the back off yourself, worked the suspect tubes out of their sockets, and laid them gently in the bag. Then you walked them down to the corner. There, somewhere between the magazine rack and the pharmacy counter, stood a machine that did one honest job. It was a tall cabinet with a sloped top full of sockets, a big meter across the front, and a printed chart of tube numbers. Below it, behind a little door, sat a stock of brand new tubes for sale. You looked up your tube on the chart, found the socket it matched, pushed it in, and pressed the button. The needle swung over into the green for good, or it sat in the red and told you that tube was finished. If it read bad, you opened the door, found the same number, and bought a fresh one on the spot. These testers stood in drugstores and hardware stores, in service stations, and even some big grocery stores from the late 1920s until the early 1970s. A rote man came around to keep the cabinet stocked and took his cut of the sales. Plenty of us were the kids sent down with the bag, proud to be trusted with the errand, reading those numbers off the chart out loud. It was a small thing and a good one, and it rested entirely on a tube being something a person could pull out and hold in a hand. That was about to change. When the tubes ran out. The sets that came into the shop in the late 1960s looked different on the inside. Where there had been a glass tube, now there was a small black sliver with metal legs, a transistor, soldered down flat against the board and not meant to come out. Through that decade, the transistors crept in, a few at first in the low-power corners of the circuit, then more of them, doing the work the tubes had done with far less heat and no orange glow at all. Then came the integrated circuit. By the early 1970s, the chip was good enough to use in a television, and a single one could do the job that had taken a tube and a dozen parts around it. The makers were glad of it. A set built with chips broke down far less often and cost less to build. For the man who bought the television, this was all to the good. For the man who fixed it, the ground was shifting under his feet. You could not pull a chip and walk it to the drugstore. You could not swap it in 10 minutes in a customer's living room. The work that was left moved down to the level of the board itself, soldered joints and surface parts, And more it called for the maker's own service data and the maker's own replacement boards, when those could be had at all. The whole logic of the trade had rested on one fact, that the part most likely to fail was the part easiest to replace. The chip turned that fact around. A federal study of the industry found that American color sets in 1974 needed service about 5 times as often as the Japanese sets. And by 1979, as the American sets improved, still about twice as often. The imported set was simply giving less trouble, and as sets grew more reliable, they also grew cheaper, until the arithmetic that had kept the repairman in business turned against him. An early 1970s console color set ran around $500. By the middle of the 1980s, you could carry home a 20-inch color set for about that same $500. In a decade when $500 bought a good deal more than it once had. The arithmetic was brutal in its plainness. When a new set cost about what a repair cost, the repair stopped making sense. There was little reason to pay a man to fix an old television when the same money put a newer, lighter, more reliable one in the room. Households did that math without anyone teaching it to them. The sets that broke went to the curb instead of to the shop. By then, the television had stopped being something a country made for itself anyway. The familiar American names were selling off their factories and moving the building of sets overseas where it could be done faster and for less. There was no villain in it. The factories were simply going where the work was cheaper, and that shift came whether or not anyone welcomed it. But the man with the wood case felt it before most, because the calls that had filled his week began, one by one, to stop coming. What happened to him and his shop was the quiet part of the story. A trade the world outgrew. The phone book got thinner every year under the heading for television repair. A man would notice that the names he had known for 30 years were dropping off the page. This one retired. That one passed on. The corner shop was now selling something else, or standing empty with paper over the glass. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the shops went quiet, one after another. A trade group that counted these businesses watched their number fall from around 20,000 to something nearer 5,000 over about 20 years. Behind every one of those was a man, and most of them had seen it coming. The ones who could, bent with the change. A man who understood electronics could learn to fix the computers arriving in every office, or turn to the old radios and amplifiers a younger crowd was beginning to prize again. Others simply locked the door for the last time, drove home, and were something else after that, or were retired whether they had planned on it or not. It would be easy to tell this as a sad story, and there was sadness in it. But the men who did this work were not failures of progress, and the work was not foolish for ending. They had answered a real need for as long as the need lasted. A television in those years was built to be opened and put right by a person. And for 40 years, there were people in every town who could do exactly that. The world did not need them to be wrong in order to move on from them. It simply moved. When the last of the shops closed, the town lost more than a way to mend a television. It lost something quieter, the plain belief that a thing worth buying was worth keeping and worth fixing when it broke. The men with the wood cases had lived inside that belief and made their living by it. When the throwaway set arrived, the belief went out the door with the trade that had served it. The repairman himself would likely have called it just the way of things and gone back to his bench. He had not vanished completely, though. In a few quiet corners, the old work was still being done the caddy he left behind. By now, there is an attic somewhere with a wood box in it that no one had opened in years. The man who carried it was likely gone, and his children, clearing the house, had found the thing heavy and strange, and not quite known what to do with it. Inside, his tube caddy held what it always held: rows of little cartons, RCA and Sylvania, each tube still seated in its slot, some of them never used. A working life sat in that box. More than one of us had wondered exactly that about a father's case: where it went, whether it survived, who had it now. The trade left more than that behind. A small and stubborn band of people had taken up the old sets as a calling, restoring them one at a time. There were museums for early television, with men who knew how to bring a 1948 set back to a clear picture. There were clubs that met and swapped parts and tested tubes for one another the way the corner store once did. They worked carefully, because a picture tube could hold a charge of some 30,000 volts long after it had been unplugged, and they respected it. What had been a trade in every town survived as a craft in a few devoted hands. For most of us, the repairman lived on in plainer ways. He was the smell of hot dust and solder we caught when somebody pulled the back off a set. There was the memory of a patient man kneeling on the rug with a meter in his hand, telling our mother it would be ready Thursday. And there was the wood case set down by the door, and the wonder of a boy who got to look inside it. That case was the thing that stayed. The man knew every tube in it by its number and its job, and he carried the whole working knowledge of his trade in one box he could lift with one hand. When he set it down inside your door, he set down something that the next set, and every set after it, would never need again. Open the case one more time in your mind. The lid lifts on its little hinge. The cartons are still there in their rows, the names half faded, the glass inside cool now and dark. It is a beautiful and useless thing today, and it was once the most practical box a man could own. We do not call anyone when the television goes dark anymore. We carry it to the curb, or we do not, and we bring home another in a flat carton from a store that sells 100 of them. There is nothing wrong with that. The new set costs less and gives far less trouble. But something quiet went out of the house when the last man with a wood case stopped coming, and most of us felt it without quite naming it. He knew our set, and he knew our name. He knew the machine in the corner that the family gathered around every night. And when it went wrong, he set it right and stayed for a cup of coffee while he did. The case he carried held the means to mend the one machine we could not do without. And for 40 years, there was a man like that in every town. The box sits closed now, on a shelf, in an attic, in a memory. It is not coming back, and it does not need to. It was enough that it was here.